220 bushels per acre. It was a number that did not belong in the dry-line country of the Western Plains, a number that felt like a misprint, a fever dream from the corn-rich heart of Iowa transplanted by mistake into the hard-bitten clay of Garrison County. It was a harvest of myth, the kind of yield old men talked about after their third whiskey, a fiction spun to impress their grandchildren. But by the time Eli Vance's corn was weighed at the co-op, the number was no longer a myth. It was a fact, printed on a scale ticket, verified by the stunned elevator manager, and whispered in every diner and feed store for 100 miles. By then, of course, nobody was laughing. But they were laughing the day he bought the land. They were laughing loud enough to shake the dust from the rafters of the county auction hall, a cruel, knowing laughter that dismissed the boy and the dirt in one shared breath of condescending certainty. For 30 years, the parcel had been a monument to failure, a scar on the landscape known only as the Henderson Place, and everyone in that room knew you couldn't grow a thing on it but regret. Everyone, that is, but the quiet young man with his grandfather's notebook in his coat pocket and a coffee can full of folded bills in his hand. The auction was held in the old VFW Hall, a long, low building that smelled of stale beer, decades of accumulated cigarette smoke baked into the wood paneling and the damp wool of farmers' coats. It was a cathedral of pragmatism, a place where the value of a man's life work, his land, his machinery, his legacy, was boiled down to the rhythmic, hypnotic chant of an auctioneer and the subtle twitch of a bidder's finger. The men who gathered there were not dreamers. They were survivors, their faces topographical maps of sun and worry, their hands thick and calloused, permanently curved as if still holding a steering wheel or a wrench. They spoke in a shorthand of crop prices, rainfall totals, and the obituaries of broken-down equipment. Into this world of hardened certainty, Eli Vance arrived like a ghost from a forgotten time. He parked his truck, a 1978 Ford with a coat of primer gray paint and a long, jagged scar of rust along the driver's side door, at the far end of the lot, away from the polished new Rams and Silverados. He was 24, but a lingering leanness in his frame and a quiet solemnity in his eyes made him seem both younger and older at the same time. He wore jeans that were clean but worn pale at the knees, boots that had been resoled more than once, and a canvas work coat that had belonged to his father. He moved with a deliberate economy of motion, a stillness that was often mistaken for shyness or hesitation. It was neither. It was observation. He entered the hall, and the wall of sound and heat hit him. The low hum of 100 conversations, the sharp staccato bark of the auctioneer, Jedediah Jed Stone, calling for bids on a set of disc harrows, the smell of coffee brewing in a large percolator at the back of the room. Eli didn't stop for coffee. He didn't greet anyone. He found an empty folding chair against the back wall, a position that gave him a clear view of the entire room, and sat. He placed a dented red Folgers coffee can between his feet. The lid was secured with a thick rubber band. Inside was not coffee, but the sum of 3 years of working oil rigs in North Dakota, every dollar saved a prayer for this very day. In the inside pocket of his coat, his fingers brushed against the worn leather cover of a small, thick notebook. The leather was smooth and supple, peeling back at the corners like a tired smile. It was his grandfather's 1948 field journal, and its weight against his chest was more real to him than the noise and skepticism of the room. He didn't need to look at the sale bill. He knew what he was there for. Lot 14, the Stonewall Creek Farm. The Stonewall Creek. 160 acres of what the entire county considered to be poisoned ground. The story was local legend, a cautionary tale told to new farmers. 30 years ago, a man named Henderson, an outsider with more ambition than sense, had bought the place and tried to turn it into a chemical-intensive cash crop operation. He had pushed the land too hard, drenched it in experimental fertilizers and pesticides, and within 5 years the yields collapsed. The soil turned hard and pale, the color of old bone. Henderson went bankrupt, leaving behind a sterile field and a cloud of rumors about what he had done. Some said he'd used a defoliant that had salted the earth. Others whispered of a chemical spill from a ruptured tank that had never been reported. Whatever the cause, the result was undeniable. For 3 decades, nothing had grown there but thistle and bindweed. The land was dead. "All right, folks, settle down," Jed Stone's voice boomed, cutting through the chatter. Jed was a man built like a barrel, with a face as red as the auction flag he held in his hand. "We're moving on to the real estate portion of our sale. First up, Lot 14, the old Henderson place." A low chuckle rippled through the crowd. Jed himself couldn't suppress a wry grin. "You all know it. 160 acres more or less, borders Stonewall Creek on the north end. We're selling it as is, where is, no warranties expressed or implied. The bank wants it off the books. Let's start the bidding low and see where it goes. Who'll give me $50 an acre? 50, 50, 50, do I hear 50? The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Not a single hand was raised, not a single head nodded. The men looked at their boots, at the ceiling, anywhere but at the auctioneer. $50 an acre was an insult, a bid for land that was practically free. And still, no one moved. It was a collective, unspoken judgment. From the front row, a man in a tailored gray suit stood and turned to face the crowd. This was Marcus Thorne. Thorne was not a farmer, though he dressed in expensive brand-new versions of what a farmer might wear. A crisp Carhartt jacket, immaculate boots that had never seen mud, a confident smile that never quite reached his eyes. He was a developer, a man who saw land not as a living thing to be stewarded, but as a grid of potential lots on a plat map. He had been buying up marginal farmland around the county, waiting for the city to expand. Thorne held up a hand as if to calm a restless audience, though the room was already still. "Jed, friends," he began, his voice smooth and practiced, the voice of a man used to being listened to. "We all know this piece of ground. My firm even did a preliminary soil analysis, thinking about a solar project." He paused for dramatic effect. "It's a dead loss. Contaminants are off the charts. The remediation costs alone would be astronomical." He turned his gaze slowly, sweeping it across the room, and it landed on Eli in the back. A flicker of amusement crossed Thorne's face as he took in the boy's worn clothes and the coffee can at his feet. "Frankly, you couldn't pay me to take that land," Thorne continued, his voice dripping with false sympathy. He kept his eyes locked on Eli. "Son," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "you can't grow dreams on poisoned dirt. Leave the real investing to the men." A wave of sycophantic laughter followed Thorne's pronouncement. It was the laughter of men who knew their place, who recognized Thorne as the new locus of power in the county. Eli felt the heat of 100 pairs of eyes on him. He felt the sting of the insult, the public dismissal. But his face remained a mask of calm. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory, a low, steady rumble from years past. "Let them talk, boy. The louder they are, the less they know. The ground has the final word. Always." Eli didn't look at Thorne. He looked at Jed Stone. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Jed's eyes, practiced at catching the slightest movement, widened for a fraction of a second. He had seen the nod. He was obligated to acknowledge it. "I have a bid at $50 an acre from the young man in the back," Jed announced, a note of surprise in his voice. The laughter died instantly, replaced by a stunned, disbelieving silence. Marcus Thorne's smile froze on his face. He turned to stare at Eli, his expression a mixture of contempt and disbelief. $50 an acre it is," Jed chanted, regaining his rhythm. "Do I hear 60? 60? $50 bid looking for 60. He scanned the room. No one moved. The farmers were now staring at Eli as if he had grown a second head. Thorne simply shook his head slowly, a look of pity on his face. "Sold," Jed Stone's voice cracked like a whip, "for $50 an acre to the young man in the back. Lot 14, 160 acres goes to... What's the name, son?" Eli stood up. The folding chair scraped against the linoleum floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent room. He picked up his coffee can. "Vance," he said, his voice clear and steady, carrying across the hall. "Eli Vance." He walked to the front, past the rows of stunned faces, past Marcus Thorne, who watched him with narrowed, calculating eyes. He didn't look at Thorne. He didn't look at anyone. He walked to the clerk's table, unsnapped the rubber band on his Folgers can, and began to count out the worn, folded bills. $8,000, the price of a dead farm, the first down payment on a promise made to a ghost. The quiet was so complete you could hear the soft whisper of the old bills as his calloused fingers separated them one from another. The memory of his grandfather was not a hazy, sentimental thing. It was a collection of tangible moments, of smells and sounds and physical laws as immutable as gravity. It was the scent of motor oil in freshly tilled earth, the specific heft of a snap-on wrench in a small boy's hand, the low, patient rumble of Silas Vance's voice explaining the intricate ballet of a diesel engine's combustion cycle. Silas had been a man carved from the same hard earth he farmed, a figure who seemed to Eli's young eyes to be less a person and more a permanent feature of the landscape, like the ancient oak tree on the hill or the slow, meandering path of Stonewall Creek. Their classroom was a sprawling, cathedral-like barn, its massive timbers dark with age and smelling of hay, dust, and the sweet metallic tang of old machinery. This was Silas's sanctuary, and Eli was his only acolyte. While other boys were playing baseball or watching cartoons, Eli was learning to read the language of a worn gear, to diagnose a misfire by sound alone, to understand that a machine was not just a collection of parts, but a story. "Everything tells you what's wrong with it, Eli," Silas would say, his hand resting on the fender of a slumbering John Deere Model A. "You just have to be quiet enough to listen. People are the same way." Silas had a philosophy that extended far beyond the mechanical. He believed that the world was a text and that true knowledge came not from being told, but from learning to read the text for yourself. The text could be the color of the smoke from an exhaust pipe, the pattern of rust on a bolt head, or the subtle shift in the angle of a weed's leaf before a rainstorm. He distrusted anything that was too easy, too polished, or too loud. "Noise is a bully," he'd tell Eli, while they sat on upturned buckets, cleaning spark plugs with a wire brush and a can of gasoline. "It tries to scare you out of thinking, but the truth is usually real quiet. You have to lean in to hear it." This philosophy was the reason for the notebooks. There were dozens of them, a whole shelf in the small, dusty office at the back of the barn. Each one was a different year, a different color of leather or canvas, but they all contained the same meticulous, almost fanatical documentation of the farm's life. Silas recorded everything. Daily rainfall totals measured in an old coffee can, the dates the first robins appeared, the price of diesel at the co-op. But the heart of each notebook was the soil. Silas Vance had a relationship with his land that bordered on the mystical, yet was rooted in the profoundly practical. He didn't see it as dirt. He saw it as a living, breathing organism with a history, a personality, and a long, slow memory. His most sacred text, the one he returned to again and again, was the 1948 notebook. It was the first one he had started after returning from the war, the year he took over the farm from his own father. That notebook was different. It wasn't just about recording what was. It was about discovering what could be. Eli remembered a specific day. He was 10 years old, and a long, dry summer had baked the fields into a cracked, concrete-like expanse. The corn was stunted, its leaves curled in on themselves like fists. Eli's own father, a good man who had tried to farm with spreadsheets and chemical company recommendations, was near despair. He'd walk the fields at night, his silhouette a study in defeat against the setting sun. The bank was calling. The tension in their small farmhouse was a physical presence, thick and suffocating. One afternoon, Silas found Eli sitting in the barn, staring at a disassembled carburetor, a puzzle he couldn't solve. Silas didn't say anything about the carburetor. He sat down on the hay bale next to him. "Your dad's a good farmer," Silas said, which surprised Eli. "He's just listening to the wrong people. He's listening to men in nice shirts who drive new cars and sell solutions in a plastic jug. They're selling him a shortcut. But the land, it doesn't believe in shortcuts." Silas stood up and motioned for Eli to follow him. He led him to the dusty shelf and pulled down the 1948 notebook. He opened it to a page marked with a faded red ribbon. The page was covered in Silas's neat compact script, interspersed with strange diagrams and columns of numbers. "Look here," Silas said, his thick finger tracing a line on a hand-drawn map of the farm. "This is our farm, but it's not the farm you see. It's the farm that's 20 feet down. He explained that in the winter of 1948, he hadn't just been repairing fences. He had taken a hand-cranked soil auger and, with the help of a neighbor just as curious as he was, had spent 3 months drilling test holes across every acre he owned. He was mapping the geology of his own world. "Everyone farms the top 6 inches," Silas said, his voice filled with a rare, quiet passion. "They worry about the topsoil, and they should, it's important. But the real secret, the thing that makes this piece of ground different from the one next door, is the deep story, the subsoil, the bones of the land." His finger stopped on a shaded area of the map, a section that corresponded to the west pasture. "Right here," he said, 18 feet down, there's a seam of green marl. It's not on any government map. My own father didn't know it was there. It's like a buried sponge, 100 acres wide and 10 feet thick. It holds water from the wet years and saves it for the dry ones. When you get a drought like this one, most people's corn roots hit dry, hard clay and they give up. But on that pasture, if you plant the right kind of corn with the right kind of deep roots, those roots will go all the way down. They'll find that marl, and they won't just survive, they'll thrive. He then showed Eli the corresponding notes. He had recorded the marl's pH, its composition, its exact depth to the inch in dozens of locations. He had cross-referenced it with weather data from the 1930s Dust Bowl, hypothesizing how the marl had kept that part of the farm from blowing away. It was a breathtaking document, a work of profound, patient observation. It was science, but it was also a love letter to a piece of ground. "So why doesn't Dad plant there?" Eli asked, his young mind reeling with the implications. Silas's face grew sad. He closed the notebook gently. "Because he thinks this is just a book of stories," he said quietly. "He went to agricultural college. They taught him that all the answers are in a bag or a bottle now. They taught him that what an old man wrote down 50 years ago is just folklore." He looked at Eli, his gaze intense. "It's not folklore, boy. It's evidence. It's truth you earn with a shovel, not one you buy in a store. Don't you ever forget that." That conversation was the beginning of Eli's real education. While his father struggled, trying to force the land to conform to the university's models, Eli spent his hours with Silas, absorbing the old man's world. He learned to weld. He learned to grind valves. He learned to read wiring diagrams. But most importantly, he learned to read the notebooks. Silas taught him how to cross-reference data, how to see patterns over decades, how to understand that the land was a system of infinite complexity, and that the only honest approach was humility. The formative trauma was not one single event, but a slow, grinding decline. Eli's father, Richard, was a man caught between two worlds. He loved his father, Silas, but he was also a man of his generation, a generation that had been taught to believe in progress, efficiency, and the new miracles of modern agriculture. He had a degree in agronomy, a line of credit at the bank, and a subscription to every major farm journal. He had all the tools of modern success, and he failed completely. He leased more land, bought bigger, more expensive equipment, and followed the advice of the slick, confident salesman from the chemical companies. He was chasing yields, entering a high-stakes game where the cost of entry, the seed, the fertilizer, the pesticides, the fuel, kept rising, while the price of his crop remained at the mercy of a global market he couldn't control. He was running faster and faster just to stay in the same place. Eli watched it happen from the perspective of a child who understands emotion long before he understands economics. He saw the worry etched into his mother's face as she pored over bills at the kitchen table late at night. He heard the hushed, tense arguments that would stop the moment he entered a room. He felt the farm's mood shift from one of hopeful industry to one of quiet desperation. The shiny new tractor, once a symbol of pride, became a monument to debt, its massive tires seeming to sink into the ground under the weight of its own financing. Silas watched it all with a profound, aching sadness. He never said, "I told you so." He offered his help, his advice, his own savings, but Richard was too proud, too invested in his own path to accept it. To accept Silas's help would have been to admit that his own education, his own modern methods, were a failure. So he doubled down, taking out another loan, trying another experimental hybrid seed, another revolutionary soil additive. The end came, not with a bang, but with a quiet, official-looking letter in the mail. The foreclosure notice. The day the bank came to inventory, the equipment was the day Eli's childhood ended. He was 14. He stood beside Silas at the edge of the yard, watching as men in shirts with the bank's logo on them walked through the barn, putting tags on everything. His father's tractor, the planter, the combine, even Silas's old Model A, which Richard had used as collateral. Richard was nowhere to be seen. He had locked himself in the house. But Eli's mother, a woman of quiet strength who had endured it all with a fierce protective love for her family, stood on the porch, her face pale but her back straight. When one of the bankmen tried to put a tag on the old anvil in Silas's workshop, an anvil that had been in the family for 100 years, Silas stepped forward. "That doesn't belong to the bank," Silas said, his voice low but carrying an authority that made the man pause. "That was never part of any loan." The man, a young, nervous city kid, looked at his clipboard. "Sir, the lien is on all assets and equipment at this address." "That anvil is not equipment," Silas said, placing his hand on its cool, worn surface. "It's a tool, and it's mine. You want it? You'll have to take it from me." There was a moment of tense silence. The young banker looked at Silas, at the old man's calloused hands, his clear, unblinking eyes, and saw something that wasn't on his spreadsheet. He saw a line he wasn't willing to cross. He muttered an apology and moved on. They lost the farm. They moved into a small rental house in town. Richard found work at the auto parts store, a broken man surrounded by the ghosts of the machines he once commanded. The shame of his failure clung to him like dust. He had done everything he was told to do, followed all the modern rules, and it had led him to ruin. He had confused price with value, and the cost was his family's legacy. A year later, Silas passed away quietly in his sleep. At the reading of the will, there was little to give. A small insurance policy for Eli's mother. His tools for Richard, who could barely look at them. And for Eli, there was a specific bequest. "To my grandson, Eli Vance," the lawyer read, "I leave my complete collection of farm journals with the hope that he will understand their true value. And I leave him this advice. Trust the ground, not the salesman. The ground remembers." Eli took the notebooks. He spent the next few years finishing high school, working odd jobs, helping his mother keep their small household afloat. He was a quiet, serious young man, haunted by the memory of his family's failure. He saw how the community looked at his father with a mixture of pity and contempt. The man who had flown too close to the sun, the man who had lost the Vance farm. The day Eli turned 18, he enlisted in the army. He needed to get away. He needed to prove to himself that he was not his father, that he was not destined to repeat the same mistakes. But as he traveled the world, he kept the notebooks with him. In the quiet hours in a barracks in Germany, in the back of a Humvee in Afghanistan, he would read them. He wasn't just reading about farming. He was reading about a way of being in the world, a way of paying attention, a way of valuing patience, humility, and the hard-won truth of empirical evidence. And in all his reading, one piece of land kept calling to him. A place his grandfather had studied with a peculiar intensity. Silas had never owned it, but he had walked it, taken secret soil samples from it, and filled pages of his notebooks with theories about it. It was the old Henderson place. Silas had been fascinated by its failure. "Nature doesn't just die like that," he had written in a 1985 entry. "Something is capping it. Something is holding it down. The life is still there, deep down. It's just waiting for someone to open the door." In the 1948 notebook, the one that mapped the deep geology of the area, there was a page that Eli had read 100 times. It showed the Stonewall Creek farm, and next to it, the Henderson place. A thick, dark line, representing the green marl seam, ran directly from Silas's land under the fence and deep into the heart of the Henderson property. Silas had drawn an arrow pointing to it and written a single, tantalizing question. Is it still there? When Eli's enlistment was over, he didn't go back to the rental house in town. He went to the oil fields of North Dakota. The work was brutal, the hours long, the conditions unforgiving. But the pay was good. He lived in a trailer, ate cheap food, and saved every penny. He wasn't saving for a new truck or a down payment on a house. He was saving for 160 acres of dead land. He was saving to answer his grandfather's question. He was saving to buy back his family's name, not by reclaiming the old farm, but by proving the value of the old ways on the one piece of ground everyone else had given up on. He was going to open the door. The day after the auction, Eli drove his old Ford out to his new property. He didn't park at the dilapidated gate that hung crookedly from a single hinge. He drove past it, bumping along the faint track of an old farm lane until he reached the center of the property. He got out and stood on the hood of his truck, looking out over his domain. It was a desolate sight. The field was a uniform pale brown, a matted carpet of dead thistle and last year's weeds. The soil, where it was visible, was cracked and gray, the color of ash. There were no signs of life, no birds circling, no rabbits darting through the undergrowth. It was a landscape of profound silence, a silence that felt less like peace and more like absence. To any other farmer, it would have been a portrait of despair. To Eli, it was a blank canvas. He spent the first week not with a tractor, but with a shovel and his grandfather's notebook. He walked the land in a grid pattern, just as Silas had done 60 years before. At each intersection of his imaginary grid, he would stop, consult the 1948 map, and then begin to dig. He wasn't just digging holes, he was reading the story of the soil, layer by layer. The first 6 inches were just as everyone said, hard, compacted, and lifeless. It was like trying to dig through a brick. Below that was a layer of dense, impermeable clay, the hard pan. This was the cap, the lid on the coffin that had sealed the farm's fate. It was a product of years of shallow plowing and the weight of heavy equipment compacting the wet soil. For 30 years, rainwater had hit this layer and run off, carrying the thin topsoil with it. Plant roots had hit it and turned back, unable to penetrate to the moisture below. But Eli kept digging. He was a young man, strong from years of hard labor, and he drove the shovel into the hard pan with a steady, rhythmic grunt, 1 foot, 18 inches, 2 feet. The clay was relentless. Then, at a depth of about 28 inches, something changed. The feel of the shovel was different. The sound it made was no longer a sharp scrape, but a soft, satisfying thump. Eli dropped to his knees and reached into the hole. He pulled out a handful of soil. It was cool and dark, rich with moisture. It crumbled in his hand, not like dust, but like a piece of rich chocolate cake. He brought it to his nose. It smelled of earth. It smelled of life. This was the old topsoil, the original layer that had been buried by Henderson's disastrous plowing techniques. It had been preserved, protected under the hard pan for 3 decades, a buried treasure. And below that, as he dug deeper with a hand auger, he found it. The green marl. It was exactly where Silas's notebook said it would be. A thick, greenish-gray seam of clay and calcium carbonate, cool to the touch and holding the memory of 1,000 ancient rains. He had his answer. It was still there. His plan was simple in its concept, but monumental in its execution. He couldn't afford to plow the entire field deep enough to break the hard pan. He didn't have the equipment or the fuel, but he didn't need to. He just needed to open the door. He needed to create pathways, channels that would connect the thirsty surface to the living world below. He went to a farm auction in the next county and bought what no one else wanted, an old single-arm post hole digger that mounted on the 3-point hitch of a tractor. It was a tool for fencing, not for farming. He also bought a pallet of rusty surplus steel auger bits, each 6 feet long. He spent a week in his rented workshop, welding, grinding, and modifying. He attached the long auger bits to the post hole digger's gearbox, reinforcing the frame with scrap steel. He was building a machine that had no name, a tool for a job no one else had ever thought to do. Then the work began. He started at the north end of the field, his old Ford tractor chugging along, the strange contraption on the back looking like some kind of medieval torture device. Every 10 feet he would stop the tractor, engage the PTO, and drill a hole. The auger would screw its way through the hard pan, punch through the buried topsoil, and stop when it hit the marl seam. He would then fill the hole with a mixture of composted manure and straw he got for free from a local dairy farmer, creating a series of deep organic wicks that would draw moisture up and allow air and roots to penetrate down. It was slow, tedious, back-breaking work. He worked from sunup to sundown, 7 days a week. The noise of his tractor and the strange, rhythmic drilling echoed across the valley. His neighbors, the same men who had laughed at him in the auction hall, would slow their trucks as they drove by, staring at the lone figure on the old tractor, pecking endless holes in a dead field. They didn't understand what they were seeing. It looked like madness. They started calling him the woodpecker. Marcus Thorne heard the stories. He, more than anyone, was intrigued by Eli's strange obsession. Thorne was not a stupid man. He was arrogant and greedy, but not stupid. He knew that no one worked that hard for nothing. The boy had to have an angle. Thorne's initial theory was that Eli had found some geological anomaly, a gravel deposit perhaps, that he was planning to sell to the County Road Commission. But the constant grid-like pattern of the drilling didn't fit that theory. One hot afternoon in late summer, Thorne's gleaming white pickup truck pulled up at the edge of the field where Eli was working. Thorne got out, his city boots sinking slightly into the loose dirt. He leaned against the fence, watching Eli finish drilling a hole. Eli saw him but didn't acknowledge him. He finished his work, shut down the tractor, and wiped his hands on an oily rag. He walked over to the fence, his face beaded with sweat and smudged with grease. "Vance," Thorne said, his voice a little too friendly, "making a lot of holes." "Seems to be the work that's needed," Eli replied, his voice flat. "Mind if I ask what the grand plan is?" Thorne asked, gesturing at the field, which now looked like a giant pockmarked pegboard. "You starting a fence company?" Eli just looked at him, his expression unreadable. "I'm farming." Thorne laughed, a short, sharp bark. "Farming? Son, I've seen farming. This isn't it. Come on, what's the play? You found something? I'm a reasonable man. Maybe we can work together. I have capital. You have... whatever this is." He waved a hand dismissively at Eli's tractor. "My offer still stands. I'll buy you out, right now, 20% over what you paid. That's a tidy profit for a few months of playing in the dirt." This was the moment Eli had been preparing for. This was the test. It wasn't just about the land anymore. It was about the principle. It was about his grandfather's legacy versus Thorne's transactional world. "No, thank you, Mr. Thorne," Eli said, his voice quiet but firm. "The land's not for sale." Thorne's friendly mask slipped, his eyes narrowed. He was not used to being told no, especially by someone he considered so far beneath him. "Don't be a fool, kid. That's a good offer. It's more than this dirt will ever be worth. What are you going to do, grow a crop of fence posts?" Eli allowed himself a small ghost of a smile. "Something like that." He turned and walked back to his tractor, leaving Thorne standing at the fence, his face flushed with anger and confusion. The refusal mystified Thorne. It didn't fit his models. Everyone had a price. If the boy wasn't after a quick profit, then what was he after? The only other possibility Thorne could conceive of was that Eli was playing a longer game. He must have found some loophole in the county zoning laws. He must be preparing the land for residential development. He was trying to cut Thorne out and take the big prize for himself. Thorne's frustration curdled into a new, more dangerous resolve. If the boy wouldn't sell, he would be squeezed. Thorne would show him what real power looked like. He would crush the quiet, stubborn boy and take the land for himself. He mistook Eli's silence for weakness, his patience for ignorance. It was the most expensive mistake Marcus Thorne would ever make. He had just walked into a trap and he didn't even know it was there. The first frost came, and Eli's strange drilling operation ceased. He had perforated the entire 160 acres, a grid of thousands of deep compass-filled channels that were now invisible beneath a light dusting of snow. To the casual observer, the field looked exactly as it had before, barren and empty. But beneath the surface, a slow, quiet miracle was taking place. Water from the melting snow was not running off. It was being wicked down into the earth through Eli's channels, rehydrating the buried topsoil and creating a network of moisture that reached all the way to the marl seam. The land was breathing again for the first time in 30 years. Marcus Thorne, meanwhile, began his campaign. It was a war fought not with tractors, but with whispers and influence. He opened a sleek modern office in a vacant storefront on Garrison's main street, calling it Thorne Agri Solutions and Development. He hired a pretty receptionist from the city and filled the window with glossy architectural renderings of Stonewall Meadows, a proposed housing development featuring cookie-cutter houses on quarter-acre lots, its centerpiece a man-made pond where the Henderson Farms dilapidated barn now stood. He hosted a Farmer Appreciation Day, a barbecue with free beer and hot dogs, held in the parking lot of his new office. Most of the county's farmers showed up for the free food. Thorne gave a speech, standing on a makeshift stage, a microphone in his hand. He talked about progress, about the future, about maximizing the value of their assets. He never mentioned Eli by name, but his target was clear. There are some folks, Thorne said, his voice resonating with sincerity, who are held back by nostalgia. They want a farm like their grandfathers did, and that's a fine sentiment. But you can't take sentiment to the bank. The future of Garrison County isn't in small-time backyard operations. It's in smart, consolidated professional management of our land resources. It's about looking forward, not backward. He then moved to isolate Eli financially. He learned that Eli's only significant asset, his old Ford tractor, was financed through a small personal loan from the Garrison County Community Bank, the same bank that held the mortgage on Thorne's new office. Thorne invited the bank president, a man named Henderson, no relation to the farm's previous owner, a fact that added a layer of cosmic irony, to a fancy dinner in the city. He talked about his big plans, the influx of new residents his development would bring, the new accounts they would open. He casually mentioned the eyesore on the edge of town, the failed experiment, being conducted by a certain young man. He suggested that the bank might want to review its more unconventional loans. He wasn't asking for anything illegal. He was just applying pressure, creating an atmosphere of risk around Eli. The bank president called Eli the following week. He was apologetic but firm. Given the unusual nature of Eli's agricultural methods and the lack of any demonstrable progress, the loan committee felt it was necessary to call in the note. Eli had 30 days to pay the remaining balance of $5,000, or the bank would be forced to repossess the tractor. The news was a body blow. The tractor was his life. Without it, his entire plan was impossible. He had used the last of his oil field money for the land and the down payment. He had nothing left. For the first time since he had started, a sliver of despair worked its way into his heart. He sat in his small, rented room, the foreclosure letter from the bank on his table, a mirror image of the one that had destroyed his family years ago. He felt the weight of his father's failure settling on him. Maybe Thorne was right. Maybe he was just a fool, playing with ghosts in a dead field. He pulled out the 1948 notebook. He needed to feel the worn leather, to hear his grandfather's voice. He opened it to a random page. It was a section from the winter of 1952, a year of deep snow and bitter cold. Silas had been trying to repair the engine on his corn picker, but a crucial part had broken, and he didn't have the money to replace it. The entry was a litany of frustration and near despair. Busted the main bearing on the picker. Part costs $30. I have 2. The snow is 3 feet deep and the corn is still in the field. Mary says we can wait, says the Lord will provide. I think the Lord helps those who help themselves, but right now I don't know how. Eli read on. The next entry was a week later. Took the old forge apart, found a piece of leaf spring from a Model T in the scrap pile, spent 2 days hammering it out. It's not pretty, but it's the right shape. It might hold. The final entry on the page was dated a month later. Finished harvest today. The forged bearing held, made $20 more than I needed for the new part. We'll use it to buy Mary a new coat. The land provides, but sometimes you have to make the tools yourself. Eli closed the notebook. The answer was there. It was always there. You don't give up, you don't give in, you make the tools yourself. He wouldn't lose his tractor. He would earn the money to save it. But how? He couldn't get a job in town. That would mean abandoning the farm. He needed to make the farm itself pay. But it was winter. There was nothing to sell. Then he remembered the barn. The old Henderson barn was a collapsed, rotting hulk, a dangerous ruin that Thorne's plan had marked for demolition, but Silas's notes had mentioned it. Henderson built his barn with old-growth pine he cleared from the south ridge. Foolish to clear the ridge, but he used good wood. Straight, tight grain. That wood is better than anything you can buy today. The next morning, Eli was at the barn, not with a tractor, but with a chainsaw and a pry bar. He spent the next 3 weeks in a frenzy of dangerous, back-breaking labor. He carefully dismantled the old barn, one giant hand-hewn beam at a time. He salvaged every piece of that old-growth pine, pulling the hand-forged nails, scraping away the rot, and stacking the good wood in neat piles. It was beautiful lumber, dense and fragrant, with a rich, dark patina of age. He loaded the best of the beams onto a flatbed trailer he borrowed from a sympathetic old farmer, one of the few men who had not laughed at the auction, and drove them to a high-end architectural salvage yard in the city. The owner, a man with a long gray beard and an eye for quality, took one look at the wood and his eyes lit up. He ran his hand over the tight grain, noting the marks of the old adze that had squared the beams. "This is the good stuff," the man said, his voice full of reverence. "They don't grow trees like this anymore." He offered Eli a price that made his jaw drop. It was more than enough to pay off the tractor, with enough left over to buy the seed and fertilizer he would need for the spring planting. He had turned a liability, a worthless ruin, into a valuable asset. He had made the tools himself. When Thorne heard that Eli had paid off the tractor loan, he was furious. He drove out to the Henderson place and saw the barn was gone, replaced by a neat stack of firewood and a clean, empty space. The boy was like a weed. Every time Thorne tried to root him out, he came back stronger. The squeezing wasn't working. It was time to escalate. It was time to bring in the law. Thorne's plan was elegant in its predatory simplicity. He would use the county's own regulations against Eli. He filed a petition with the Garrison County Planning and Zoning Board to have the Henderson property rezoned from agricultural to non-arable development. The justification for the rezoning was his own firm's soil analysis, the one he had mentioned at the auction, which showed the land was contaminated and agriculturally worthless. If the board approved the rezoning, it would be a public official declaration that the land could not be farmed. This would make any attempt by Eli to get an agricultural loan or crop insurance impossible. It would also be the first legal step toward getting the land approved for Thorne's subdivision. It was a checkmate move. The hearing was set for a Tuesday night in March. The meeting room at the county courthouse was packed. Thorne had made sure of it, calling in his markers, encouraging the local business community to show up in support of his forward-looking project. The room was divided, a physical representation of the county's soul. On one side sat Thorne's people, the bankers, the real estate agents, the men in suits who saw the future in terms of growth and profit. On the other side sat the farmers, their faces grim, their arms crossed. They weren't there to support Eli. Most of them still thought he was a fool, but they were deeply suspicious of Thorne and his talk of rezoning agricultural land. It set a dangerous precedent. Eli sat alone in the front row, directly facing the 5-member board. He wore the same clean, worn clothes he always did. In his lap, he held the 1948 notebook. Thorne, looking confident and magnanimous, began the presentation. He had a slideshow, a laser pointer, and a voice that oozed reason. He showed the board charts and graphs detailing the soil contamination. He showed them the beautiful renderings of Stonewall Meadows. He talked about the jobs it would create, the tax revenue it would generate. He was selling them a dream, and he was very good at it. The simple, unfortunate fact, Thorne concluded, his voice heavy with fake regret, is that this land is dead. It is a blight on our beautiful county. My project will remediate this blight and turn a useless piece of dirt into a thriving community. It's a win-win for everyone. He then paused, and in a move of pure, arrogant theater, he turned and pointed to Eli. "Now, I know Mr. Vance has been, playing out there. And I admire his youthful enthusiasm, but we have to deal in facts, not fantasies. We can't let one young man's sentimental attachment to a lost cause stand in the way of progress for the entire county. He's trying to grow a crop on what is essentially a hazardous waste site. It's not just foolish, it's irresponsible." Thorne then played his trump card. "But you don't have to take my word for it. In the interest of full transparency, I've commissioned a new, independent soil analysis from one of the state's top agronomists. Her report will confirm everything I've said." He gestured to a woman sitting in the front row. "I'd like to introduce Dr. Eris Thorne from the State University Extension." A woman in her late 30s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, stood and walked to the podium. The shared surname was not lost on the audience. A low murmur went through the room. Thorne smiled. Using his own niece, a respected academic, was a masterstroke. It gave his claims the unimpeachable veneer of science and family integrity. Dr. Thorne set up her own slideshow. She was professional, clinical, and precise. At my uncle's request, she began, making it clear who had hired her, I conducted a series of soil core tests across the 160-acre parcel in question. We tested for a full spectrum of common agricultural contaminants, as well as analyzing the soil for its basic composition and nutrient content. She clicked to the next slide. It showed a map of the farm dotted with red flags, indicating her test sites. Our initial findings were consistent with the report from Thorne Development, she said. The topsoil, to a depth of approximately 6 to 10 inches, is severely compacted, low in organic matter, and shows elevated levels of certain residual salts consistent with over-fertilization. Marcus Thorne leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smirk on his face. This was going perfectly. However, Dr. Thorne continued, and the word hung in the air, as we analyzed the deeper cores, we found anomalies. She clicked to the next slide. It was a complex graph with multiple colored lines. This graph shows nutrient levels by depth. As you can see, the blue line, representing the topsoil, is flat and low. But the green and red lines, representing samples taken from between 24 and 48 inches, show something remarkable. The levels of calcium, magnesium, and available nitrogen are not just acceptable, they are optimal. In some cases, they are higher than any baseline we have for this county. The room was silent. Marcus Thorne's smirk faltered. He leaned forward, squinting at the screen as if it had personally betrayed him. It was a puzzle, Dr. Thorne said, her scientific curiosity now overriding her role as a paid consultant. This nutrient-rich layer shouldn't be there, not according to any geological survey of the area. It was as if we had found a buried treasure. The problem was, it was buried under 2 feet of nearly impermeable hardpan. It was inaccessible. She paused. And then we found the holes. She clicked to a new slide. It was an aerial photograph of the farm, taken by a drone. The field was covered in a perfectly symmetrical grid of dark circular spots, invisible from the ground but starkly clear from above. These are Mr. Vance's fence posts, she said, a hint of admiration in her voice. Thousands of them. Each one is a perfectly drilled shaft, approximately 6 inches in diameter, that penetrates the hardpan and connects the barren surface to the rich living soil below. He hasn't been farming the land. He's been performing a kind of large-scale acupuncture, creating pathways for air and water to bring a dead patient back to life. The farmers on their side of the room were now sitting bolt upright, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. The woodpecker's madness was starting to look like genius. Eli Vance stood up. He did not address the board. He did not look at Marcus Thorne. He walked to the podium and placed his grandfather's notebook on it, open to a specific page. He said nothing. He simply pointed to the hand-drawn map. Dr. Eris Thorne looked down at the notebook. She saw the faded ink, the spidery script, the diagram from 1948. She saw the shaded area labeled Green Marl Seam. She looked at the map, then back at her own complex data on the screen. Her eyes widened. The 2 maps, one drawn by an old farmer with a hand auger and a pencil, the other generated by a $1,000 GPS and a state-of-the-art lab, were nearly identical. She picked up the notebook, her hands gentle, as if holding a sacred text. She read aloud from Silas Vance's notes. The life is still there, deep down. It's just waiting for someone to open the door. She looked up, her gaze sweeping from Eli to her uncle and finally to the board. The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear and decisive. It was the voice of science, of evidence, of a truth that could no longer be denied. Mr. Chairman, she said, her voice ringing with an authority her uncle had paid for but could not control. My professional assessment has changed. Based on my data, and corroborated by this extraordinary historical document, I must amend my report. She took a deep breath. This was the moment, the one sentence that would change everything. "Mr. Thorne, this isn't a dead field," she declared, her eyes locked on her uncle's. "According to my data and this 1948 logbook, this is arguably the most uniquely fertile parcel in the county. You haven't been trying to reclaim a waste site, you've been trying to bulldoze a gold mine." The silence that followed was a physical thing. It was a solid, tangible presence in the room, pressing down on everyone, filling the space between breaths. It was a silence made of 100 different emotions: the stunned disbelief of Thorne's supporters, the dawning grudging respect on the faces of the old farmers, the quiet, profound vindication radiating from the young man standing alone at the podium. Marcus Thorne's face had gone a ghastly, pale white. The confident, practiced smile was gone, replaced by a slack-jawed gape. The expensive silver pen he had been nervously clicking slipped from his numb fingers and clattered onto the polished wooden floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the stillness. No one moved to pick it up. The members of the Planning and Zoning Board looked at each other, then at Thorne, then at the young woman who had just professionally and publicly dismantled her own uncle's case. The chairman, a grizzled old rancher named McCoy, cleared his throat. The sound was unnaturally loud. He looked at Eli, then at the notebook still resting on the podium. "Mr. Vance," McCoy said, his voice a low rumble, "is there anything you'd like to add?" Eli looked up from the notebook, his gaze calm and steady. He had won. He could have gloated. He could have recited the litany of Thorne's offenses, the pressure on the bank, the public insults, the attempt to legislate him out of existence. He could have destroyed him. Instead, he simply said, "No, sir. I believe the ground has said everything that needs to be said." He picked up his grandfather's notebook, closed it gently, and walked back to his seat. The spell was broken. A low murmur started at the back of the room, a sound like wind rising in a dry field. It grew into a wave of conversation as farmers turned to each other, their faces alight with a new understanding. They were talking about subsoil, about hardpan, about the old ways. They were talking about Silas Vance, a man many of them had only known as a quiet old eccentric, but who now seemed like a prophet. Chairman McCoy banged his gavel. "The board has heard the testimony," he announced, his voice leaving no room for argument. "The petition to rezone Lot 14 is denied. This land is and will remain designated for agricultural use." He banged the gavel again. "Meeting adjourned." It was over. As the crowd began to file out, no one made eye contact with Marcus Thorne. He remained frozen in his chair, a man suddenly invisible. His allies, the bankers and businessmen, hurried past him, their faces averted, not wanting to be associated with his spectacular failure. The community, in its silent, brutal way, had already passed its verdict. He was an outsider, a man who had tried to sell them a polished lie, and he had been exposed by a quiet boy with a shovel and an old book. As Eli was leaving, an old farmer, a man named Peterson who farmed the land next to Silas's original homestead, stopped him at the door. Peterson had been one of the loudest laughers at the auction. He was a hard, skeptical man who had seen too many dreamers fail. He stood in front of Eli, blocking his path. For a moment, Eli thought there would be a confrontation. Instead, Peterson stuck out a gnarled, calloused hand. "Vance," he said, his voice gruff. He wouldn't call him Eli, not yet, but he would call him Vance. "My granddaddy used to talk about that marl seam. I always thought he was just telling stories." He shook his head, a look of wonder on his face. "Silas, he really did it, didn't he? He mapped the whole damn thing." Eli took the offered hand. The grip was like iron. "Yes, sir," Eli said. "He did." Peterson nodded, his gaze dropping to the notebook in Eli's hand. "You do him proud, boy," he said. Then he turned and disappeared into the night. It was the highest form of praise in Garrison County, a benediction offered from one generation of farmer to another. The fallout for Marcus Thorne was swift and total. The story of the planning board meeting spread through the county like a grass fire. The tale grew with each telling, becoming a modern-day fable of hubris and humility, of corporate greed versus ancestral wisdom. Thorne became a punchline in the local diner, his name synonymous with arrogant failure. His investors, who had been promised a quick and easy development project, read the minutes from the meeting, and saw a quagmire of local opposition and legal challenges. They pulled their funding overnight. The bank, seeing Thorne's support evaporate, called in the loan on his office building. The Thorne Agri Solutions and Development sign came down less than a month after it went up. The final indignity came when the local equipment dealer, a small, family-owned business where Thorne had financed a fleet of brand-new skid steers and excavators for his project, was forced to repossess them. The dealer, a man named Gus, was facing his own financial ruin. Thorne had defaulted, and the loss was big enough to sink his small operation. Eli heard about Gus's troubles from Peterson. He went to the bank the next day and withdrew a significant portion of the money he had made from the salvaged barnwood. He went to Gus's dealership. Gus was sitting in his small office, his head in his hands. "Gus," Eli said, "I heard about Thorne. I want to buy one of the skid steers." Gus looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "I can't sell them, Eli. The bank has a lien on them until Thorne's account is settled, and he's not paying. I'm finished." "What does he owe you?" Eli asked. Gus named a figure that was more than the skid steer was worth. It was the total of Thorne's entire defaulted account. Eli pulled a checkbook from his coat pocket. He wrote a check for the full amount. He pushed it across the desk. "Mark his account paid in full," Eli said, "and deliver the smallest skid steer to my farm." Gus stared at the check, then at Eli, his mouth agape. "Eli, why would you do this, after what he did to you?" "It's not for him," Eli said, his eyes on the dusty dealership floor. "It's for you. You've been here for 50 years. You shouldn't go under because of a man like him." He paused. "And on your books, just mark the account paid. No name, just paid." Eli left before Gus could argue. It was an act of quiet compassion, a detail that kept his victory from feeling like vengeance. It wasn't about crushing Thorne. It was about healing the community that Thorne had tried to exploit. He was honoring his grandfather's belief that you look after your neighbors, even the ones who laughed at you. With the spring came the planting. Eli didn't plant the whole field. He chose a 40-acre section, the one Silas's notebook had identified as having the deepest and most accessible marl seam. He used his new skid steer to spread a thick layer of compost, and then he planted his corn. He used a heritage variety, a deep-rooted breed that hadn't been popular for 50 years, but was known for its drought tolerance. The summer was hot and dry, one of the driest on record. The farmers in Garrison County watched their own crops wither. The leaves of their modern shallow-rooted hybrids curled and turned brown. They drove by Eli's farm and saw a miracle. His corn was a deep, vibrant green, its stalks thick and strong, its leaves reaching for the sky. The deep roots had found the marl, the buried sponge, and were drinking deeply from the memory of last winter's snows. When the harvest came, the combine, a brand-new model hired from a neighboring county, struggled to get through the thick stand of corn. The yield monitor in the cab ticked over into numbers the operator had never seen before. The official weigh-in at the co-op was a public event. Farmers came from all over, their faces a mixture of awe and disbelief, to watch the scale ticket print out the impossible number. 220 bushels per acre. Eli Vance became a legend. Not a loud, boastful one, but a quiet, respected one. Farmers started stopping by, their hats in their hands, asking questions. Not about money or markets, but about soil, about water, about history. Eli would welcome them, make them a cup of coffee, and pull out his grandfather's notebooks. He didn't give them answers. He taught them how to ask the right questions. He taught them how to listen to their own land. One crisp autumn evening, as Eli was cleaning the last of the corn from his auger, a dusty pickup truck pulled into his yard. A lanky teenager got out. He looked to be about 15, all elbows and earnestness. He was holding a brand-new, unblemished notebook and a pencil. "Mr. Vance?" the boy asked, his voice cracking slightly. He was the son of one of the farmers who had laughed the loudest at the auction. "Eli," he corrected him gently. "Eli," the boy repeated. "I was wondering, my dad's farm, the West Field, it's always dry, the soil it's just dead. And I was wondering how you knew, about the water. How did you know it was there?" Eli looked at the boy, at his eager, hopeful face, at the clean pages of his notebook waiting to be filled. He saw himself at that age, full of questions, standing in a dusty barn next to a wise old man. He saw the circle, the current of knowledge flowing from one pair of hands to the next. He smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. He wiped his greasy hands on a rag and gestured for the boy to follow him into the small workshop he had built where the old barn used to be. On a clean workbench, under a single bright light, lay the 1948 notebook. Eli picked it up and placed it next to the boy's new one. The contrast was stark, the old, worn, story-filled volume next to the new, empty, potential-filled one. "Let's start at the beginning," Eli said, his voice the same low, patient rumble as his grandfather's. "You have to understand, the ground has a memory, and if you're quiet enough, it will tell you everything you need to know. The land remembers. It remembers the plow, the poison, and the neglect. It remembers the hubris of men who see it only as dirt, a commodity to be bought and sold on a spreadsheet. But it also remembers the rain. It remembers the deep roots. And it remembers the men and women who are patient enough to listen to its slow, quiet story. The truth is not in the salesman's pitch or the latest trend. It is written in the layers of the earth, in the language of the weeds, in the faded ink of an old man's notebook. And that truth will wait, silent and patient, for the one person willing to pick up a shovel, to ask the right questions, and to believe in the enduring power of a legacy passed from one pair of hands to the next. For in the end, it is not what you own that matters, but what you understand. And that knowledge, once earned, can never be taken away.